I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is Off the Record. Our guest today is the author of several important books that we have been honored to bring you through Skywatch TV. His first book, 2013, called Deadly Consequences, about the Pentagon's push to put women on the front lines. The most recent books from Defender Publishing, Never Submit, Future War, and the brand new book, The Deeper State. It is our honor to welcome to our studio Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis. Bob, good to see you again.
Well, thank you, Derek.
Let's talk a little bit about your experiences in Washington that give you the insight to discuss how the secret societies, as Newt Gingrich said, elites in D.C. are angry at him because he didn't attend their clubs. He doesn't know the password. He doesn't know the secret phrase. The secret handshake was the way he put it in an interview on Fox, which was interesting because it was kind of a nod and a wink to the audience. People who have eyes to see and ears to hear understood what Mr. Gingrich was saying. You've been around Washington, D.C. for a while. What experiences do you have inside the Beltway, and how has that kind of sharpened your perceptions of what actually goes on inside the halls of power?
And Derek, I really first went to Washington when I was, I think a yearling or what's called a cow at West Point. Mm-hmm. It's a third year. My mother had been a judge down in Tennessee, one of two female judges in the state of Tennessee, and she lost an election, a very nasty election. And a good friend of hers who worked with the local congressman said, you know, why don't you come to Washington? She had divorced my stepfather, and she did. She lived in the basement with my younger brother with this lady who was the chief of staff for Senator Baker. And of course, Howard Baker was a very powerful senator at the time. And so there being at West Point, my mother in Washington, I had vacation down there, and you know, her friends became acquaintances of mine. You know, I got to, you know, walk through the tunnels of the Capitol, got to go into some of the offices, and got to know a lot of interesting people. In her interactions over the subsequent time that I was at West Point and so forth, she became acquainted with some very interesting people.
Now, this would have been during the time of what, the Nixon administration?
During the
or
Nixon
Ford?
administration,
Okay.
yeah.
Right.
I was there, you know, standing on the steps of the Senate when Nixon was inaugurated the second time.
Wow.
I was the only person there, you know, the Secret Service around. Not too many people went there that winter day. And then went to the inaugural balls afterwards. I was just a young kid, you know, but I was interested. My mother became acquainted with a lot of interesting folks. She left the Hill and worked for Gene Dixon.
And this is the psychic?
The psychic.
Yeah.
She was her personal secretary. And she stayed in a house that Gene owned right 2 blocks from the White House. So we got to know some interesting people, you know, certain ones in the occultic world, witchcraft and the like. And I've said this on Howard or on Jim Baker's show, you know, that, you know, I met some of these people. And of course, they saw right away the spirit that was in me. And I was a young Christian. I didn't know about these things, what witches and the like, what they thought. But whatever, they identified me as a Christian. And I said, well, yeah. So, you know, that was just the very beginning of my time in Washington. My mother stayed in there, married a rich man, moved to Florida after she had served in the Ford White House. And so I had some good contacts there. You know, one thing I always remember is I went to Korea as my first assignment. And my battalion commander was Colin Powell. And Colin had just left the White House as a White House fellow before he took battalion command. And I remember one day I was on a reaction force down at Osan Air Force Base for all sorts of issues. And he flew down and he said, Bob, you got to write your mother a letter. And I said, why? And he said, well, she's sitting in the White House and she's sending these nasty notes to us saying, you know, she's not heard from her son. So Colin Powell had to take a trip down to tell me to write my mother a letter. So I wrote my mother a letter. And you know, he left, and it's interesting. I really got upset in the last tour, or last part of my tour in Korea. Yeah, I saw so much immorality and then so much bad stuff. And I personally asked to talk to the division commander, called the gunfighter, very notorious sort of guy. And I said, look, I want to talk to the general. I want to tell him what's wrong with his immoral atmosphere here. And well, they didn't do that. So I knew some people on the Hill. Les Aspin at the time was the chairman of the Armed Services. So I wrote Aspin, and I said, look, these are the problems over here. You need to fix it. And I was a naive second lieutenant. And so, of course, after that tour, I went back to Washington. My mother was convinced that somebody was going to kill me because I was being so outspoken about these immoral issues. And I went to the Hill and I kind of laid it out, and Colin Powell did call me, and I didn't want to go into the details because he was, if they did an investigation, which they did, he would have been implicated to a certain degree because he was tolerant of some of that stuff. So that was my first taste, between the witchcraft, the stuff on the Hill, seeing the things on the seams, seeing it through the eyes of my mother, seeing the rich people, and then, of course, going back and seeing some of the stuff that under the cover, the immoral sorts of things that I saw, and I told the members of the Hill. I was told they did investigations. I don't know that anything really was done. Interesting, it was done by an IG, and 18, 19 years later, I was an IG.
Inspector General?
Inspector General at the Pentagon, investigating similar misconduct. So it's interesting how things occur. But that was my first exposure.
Now the type of immorality that you're talking about, as kind of a history nerd, and my ancestors were kind of early on the frontier as the European settlers moved across the Appalachians and down the Ohio River Valley. My great-great-great-grandfather was a scout and spy for General Mad Anthony Wayne.
Oh.
Wayne was sent out to prosecute war against the Shawnee and the Miami and other tribes on the frontier in Ohio and Indiana. That was the frontier in that day, because expeditions sent out under Josiah Harmer and Arthur St. Clair failed. And Harmer in particular, in fact, my great-great-great-grandfather's brother killed under Harmer, because of the camp followers, the ladies who followed the soldiers around. There was a lot of drinking and carousing that was taking place. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Oh, yeah. We had prostitutes in the field. We had prostitutes
in the field.
Oh, my company, my boss, my company commander was cavorting with a prostitute, a married man. I had enough of that. I said, look, I'm not going to tolerate this. So I was black marked. I was the guy that would go to church, and occasionally Colin Powell would sit next to me. But I really drew close to the Lord as a direct result of really going through, a testing time of myself in terms of, I knew it was wrong, and I was saying things, and these people, said, you watch that second lieutenant. He's not too happy over here, and he's saying some things. And of course, Colin Powell knew that I had connections in Washington. So that was a tough time. It was a learning experience.
It could be a lonely time.
It was a very lonely time. But fortunately, I had some good Christian friends down in Seoul. So I could get away occasionally and go down and find fellowship. And there were some good Christian officers that helped me.
How did that prepare you for what you're doing now? Because it strikes me that the position that you have now as a consultant working inside the Pentagon and inside the Beltway has got to be a lot like that time back in Korea, where you're surrounded by guys who are profiting and benefiting from the wickedness that's going on around them, and you're the one who's saying, hey, wait a minute, this shouldn't be.
Well, in fact, years later, it was helpful because, I was one of the few back in '92 when Bill Clinton was running for president that said that he wanted to open the gates to homosexuals, and I said no, that was wrong. I went out on the limb and I published some material. It was, people in the military generally don't speak out publicly.
No.
And so when I started to publish things in the media, saying this is, for a lot of reasons, wrong, that I started to take a lot of heat. And at the time I was an inspector general, and so they didn't like that. And then I was, interestingly, a fairly famous colonel at the time. Most decorated colonel we had at the time, Hackworth, Dave Hackworth.
Yes, yes, I remember him. He was a regular commentator on Fox News.
Yeah, well, Dave called me and said, look, Bob, I want to help you. You give me your material, because I wanted to put some of the material in military publications to warn people about what was happening. Dave said, I'll give it to the secretary. And he did. And so eventually I was called, and there were a couple of us put together, and we became the core of the people that wrote the law, 10 U.S.C. 654, which was passed by Congress, the homosexual ban, and of course, don't ask, don't tell. And so I was, from the very beginning, kind of one of the key people, closing the door at that time to Bill Clinton and what he had in mind. And of course, it's come back time and again. Even now, we're dealing with the transgender issue.
Right.
Over the years, I've always faced that. But going back to Korea, it gets very lonely sometimes. I'm the only person that has consistently been doing this sort of stuff from a military perspective for the last quarter century. I go outside and I do, on my cell phone, radio programs every day almost, talking about all the latest issues, mostly with the Christian world. But there are some secular programs and some television and so forth. But at some point, you have to decide what you're going to stand for. And I've tried to be consistent since that time, that very lonely and very tough time as a young officer who put it all on the line, up to the present. I am surprised that I haven't been fired a long time ago, truly. I came close to being fired when I was in the Pentagon, and in uniform, because for a variety of reasons, all to do with the homosexual issue and the politicians that knew me and didn't like what I was saying and suspected that I was not helping them. Which is true. I had no pretense about helping them. I had every intention of defeating this terrible insurgency and this evil that they wanted to perpetrate. I was the one that wrote the material that went to Congress and said, this is what's going to happen, folks, if you allow this to go forward. There's going to be the marriage issue. There's going to be the transgender issue. Absolutely everything. I wrote in 1993, and I said, that's what's going to happen. Bob Dornan, Bob invited me to testify in January of '93. So I went up there, and I didn't know any better. All the C-SPAN and all the other stuff, and I just started to say, this is what they do. And it was probably X-rated stuff, but that kind of solidified some things. And of course, then I was on Larry King, and then that started the whole media stuff for the last quarter century. But when you take a position on moral issues, especially at the national level, you're in a group of very, very few people. I mean, there are very few people in Washington that want to say the emperor has no clothes, that this is wrong and evil, this should not be done. And consistently I've been doing that. That you pointed out the first book that I wrote. It's Deadly Consequences, How Cowards Are Pushing Women to Combat. I called the president all the way down cowards. The generals that I'm working for in the Pentagon, I called cowards. I suspect that made them a little bit uncomfortable. I don't know. A lot of these guys I taught in school. Most of the 4-stars in the Army, at least, I had some impact because I used to be in charge of leadership and ethics at the infantry school. And Joe Votel, who's the CENTCOM commander today, 4-star. Right. Joe was one of my students. And I get these older guys, stars, and they come up and say, oh, you were my instructor. And I say, what did you learn? Some of them, I don't think, learned much.
Learn to keep my mouth shut.
Well,
so they don't do to me what they did to
that's right.
Colonel McGinnis.
You get in trouble when, I suspect, in hindsight, had I kept my mouth shut, I was a good officer. I worked hard. certainly as bright as any of those that I was working with and for, that I would have been promoted. But, you know, in a year prior to my retirement, I knew God wanted me to leave, to retire. I didn't know. My wife was so concerned. Goodness, she had, you don't have a job. And I said, well, Lord will provide. And he did. Gary Bauer hired me right after I retired. You know, I went in uniform on the last day, and I had my civilian coat and tie. I took off the uniform after the award ceremony and the goodbyes, and I went to Capitol Hill to testify in civilian clothes. And that was the beginning of, well, since 1993 to the present. And, you know, in Washington, when you step on toes, when you say things that, you know, make people uncomfortable, you're going to get attention, but you're not going to get the positive attention that you want to get a job. Fortunately, there were good people that gave me a job, allowed me to hone my media skills, allowed me to write hundreds and hundreds of published articles, and then to do all the stuff that I was able to do both here in this country and abroad. And that was, it was a gift of God, and it was great. During that time, of course, you know, being at FRC, and I became the vice president for policy, so I had all the policy stuff. And we'd go to the Hill, and we'd deal with all these tough social issues. And I mean, we saw some terrible things, you know, whether it was under Clinton, people would come in and try to manipulate us. Of course, not that long ago, people tried to come in and kill us.
The Family Research Council.
Yeah, Family Research. Right. And I'm still a senior fellow in the Family Research Council, so I've got a lot of years working with them. Though I'm not employed, I'm associated with them today. But I've seen so many terrible things that, that's why.
So the enemy hits from all sides. I mean, it's easy to see the enemy that's shooting at you from the front, but you say that there were those who tried to come in and try to manipulate the Family Research Council?
Oh, of course. You know, they'd seed all sorts of ideas. They'd try to create conspiracies that they would entice us to go and do things. They attack us personally. I've received death threats. You know, and I turn them over to the FBI. But, you know, you do get concerned when you go into some of these green rooms or you go into some of these public settings and you're labeled. You know, I can remember being in the Pentagon doing a BBC broadcast against one of these radical homosexuals. And he thought he was off the air. He was saying, you know, that guy's a radical evangelical. And of course, I heard him. And I've been called all sorts of things. But I think I kind of wear that as a badge of courage.
Amen.
Because, you know, I've been consistent for decades on very, very tough issues. I've put my head on the line so many times in Washington, being the very bad guy in a very secular world where they don't understand what's at stake. You know, you have so much spiritual blindness in that city. And that's part of why, you know, I talk about it here. I kind of see it, you know, the deeper state. You know, most people like Newt Gingrich, and I've introduced Newt a number of times at briefings and the like, and, you know, he's a smart guy. Newt talks about the administrative state, but then he talks about, you know, the people pulling the strings in K Street and the Soroses and the Clintons and the Kissingers and the like. But what they don't see are the spiritual, the unseen that is real in that city. You know, when I talk to Dr. Heiser, you know, he uses an illustration I think is helpful, and that is, you know, if you had these glasses on that would block out everything, the only thing in Washington that you would really see would be the evidence of Yahweh, of God, the believers that are there. And there are a few. That everything else is black, everything else is dark. And we've seen that time and time again, whether it's on, you know, I go to the Hill and I talk to a woman or a man about an issue of some gravity, and I'd get this political hack feedback saying, I can't do that because of politics. I've always liked, to think that there are a few statesmen, stateswomen in our government, but I'm coming to the point to believe that there aren't too many, and I'm certainly not having a lot of contact. So the Hill, their staff, I've dealt with the staff over the years. The bureaucracy, my neighbors are all bureaucracy, my friends are all in the FBI or the Secret Service or something or another. Of course, I'm embedded in the Pentagon staff. I've been there this time 15 years. I deal with the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, people all over the world. And I've seen things that are just continue to disturb me terribly. That we've lost our bearing as a country, and as a direct result, I fear for the future of our country.
I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, because I find this kind of curious. You mentioned that Jean Dixon, psychic,
Right.
who was psychic for Nancy Reagan, was she not? Or I think
Well, she was a psychic for a lot of people in the White House.
very,
over the
very
years.
well known.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe, but the fact that she had a house that was 2 blocks from Washington, from the
Well,
White
her
House
husband
itself.
was a realtor. And they had all sorts of real estate all over the city.
But I think when people think of the supernatural in the United States, you think of New Orleans, maybe Savannah, or other places where ghosts are supposedly more prevalent than others. You don't often think, except maybe for viewers of Skywatch TV and other programs like it, that Washington D.C. is a hub for this sort of thing. So, what gave her the access to presidents and people of power in Washington, D.C.? What were they seeking in her that they weren't getting from the Bible, from the many churches that we have in Washington, D.C.? The National Cathedral is there. Right? Why was she there? And what does that tell us about the spirit or spirits behind what's going on in Washington, D.C. now?
Well, clearly there is an evil spirit that dwells in that city, in every corner, certainly from what I've seen. As a spiritual person, there aren't too many places I haven't been. I've been in the White House many times, on Capitol Hill. I've talked to a lot of folks. I get a real sense of, kind of the spirit that I'm dealing with. I'm not a super spiritual person, but I pray daily. I read God's word. I support my local church. I support ministries. I believe deeply in a personal relationship, and yet I do discern these things. I remember a missionary. After having gone through the initial part of my life in Washington and gone off, and I married my beautiful wife now of 41 years, and we had a missionary that came in from, I think, Malaysia, and the chaplain. We were in a Bible study, and I said something about Jean Dixon and the witchcraft and my mother's association in Washington, and the missionary was very discerning, and he said, there may be an influence that is still bothering you. And I usually don't talk about these things, but we prayed, and there was something. I just don't know. It was hard. But that keeps me going. I know it's real. And as a direct result, I see so much evil. And every day I look and I try to speak the truth. And yet I know my country is in desperate times. And so I've been doing this since I was 18. God's given me a lot of opportunity. And so today, even though I could retire and probably go on and do things that are a lot easier, I continue to speak out. Here I see the president is rightly talking about, the lunacy of transgenders and the sickness of those people. You know, we're talking about war. We're talking about, you know, all sorts of things. And so I've seen so much of it that I feel compelled that as long as I have breath, I will speak up, given the opportunity. And for God's own reasons, He's given me that opportunity. Not too many people, and I recognize, you know, get the opportunities of frequent radio broadcasts. You know, I have a whole bunch of reporters I've known for decades that will call up and ask, say, you know, you come on and talk about this. Except my friends in CNN. For some reason, I can't figure it out. I have only received one call over the last 6 months, and I said I can't do it. But no, they've not come and talked to me about it. I think there's a good reason.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. When I was 18, or about that age, and I have just a very small sense of what you've gone through, and I'm not comparing my experience to yours, but just enough to, I think, understand a little bit of what you went through. I was elected vice president of the Interfraternity Council at my college, and our dean of students had said, you know, the freshman men this year have the lowest GPA of any incoming freshman class in the history of the college, which goes back to like the 1870s in Illinois. And they believed it was because we were having a rush function 5 nights a week with free alcohol. Ooh. Well, at that time in Illinois, that should not have been legal because the drinking age was 21. Yeah. I thought he was asking us to actually do something about it, and I found out pretty quickly that that was not the case. And when I realized that, instead of pursuing it and trying to speak out against it, I quit. I quit. So, again, that's nothing compared to what you've been through, but so, you know, I just have a much deeper respect for the fact that you've persevered all these years when I took the easier path.
Well, and Derek, a lot of people, especially in Washington, there's a lot of money. There's a lot of sex. There's a lot of drugs. There's a lot of big egos. You know, I have been to hundreds of green rooms with all the famous people, really. And I see what it does to people. I find it sickening. You know, as far as I'm concerned, God gave me the opportunity. I will go in and do what I'm called to do. You know, his grace that I don't have an oversized ego. I don't, because it wasn't me, it was him. But I deal with these people. I see this, and I just, you know, it boggles the mind that these people are running our country. I mean, really. You know, I see this, you know, Mr. Clapper the other day, former DNI, you know, making statements about, you know, President Trump. You know, he knows better. And yet, you know, a lot of these folks, they're trying to pad their future. They're trying to defend their ideology. They're character assassins, and they're taking advantage of the opportunity of getting on the stage and declaring the emperor doesn't have any clothes, and in fact, they don't. So there are a lot of very disappointing things. We clearly need men and women of the Lord to serve in political office. Not forever. We don't need, you know, professional politicians. You can see what those have given us. We need people in the media, you know, that are believers in Jesus Christ. And there are a few. You know, Shannon Bream. Yeah, I haven't seen Shannon recently, but Shannon's a great lady. You know, graduate of Liberty University. You know, a friend of my daughter's. There are a few. You know, I can remember going with one of the 60-minute people over to Israel many years ago, and you know, it was a religious tour of Israel. We had this former CIA director, a whole bunch of folks, and this guy was putting this tour together, and it didn't cost me anything. So I was naive at that point that what they wanted to accomplish. But he had big plans. He had an office in the Watergate. But he was trying to meld all these people together for some nefarious reason. But it was using a trip to Israel. But the substance of their lives, their testimony was just not what I was accustomed to hearing from people that that embrace Jesus as their Lord. And so, we all go through our experiences, and we would like to think the best of what goes on. But in the media, I don't see a lot of Christians. Certainly believers that I would call Christians. Certainly on Capitol Hill, there are some, but don't see a lot. And though the few that do know the Lord, I wish they would be more outspoken on some of these issues. In the government, we have a lot of believers, but they're watching over their shoulder. They're afraid of speaking out. What we used to have prayer breakfasts, and we had Bible studies. Certainly in the Pentagon, it's not as much anymore. They kind of push that to the side. In the other federal bureaucracies, the same thing, but it seems to be just not politically correct.
There was one of the tests that Satan put before Jesus when he took him up to the top of the temple, or to the high mountain, and said, "Look around, see all the kingdoms of the world,
Right.
and I will give these all to you if you just bow the knee to me."
Right.
If Satan has the kingdoms of the world, what then, and assuming that the United States is one of those,
Right.
how much impact can we as Christians have? What is our goal? Can we succeed, or are we just fighting a holding action?
Well, we're salt and light. We have to be. I don't know that we have a choice, quite frankly. I think we have to do that as long as we have breath. Now, I wish there were more.
I guess maybe the better way I should ask the question is, how do we define success in this? Because if we define success in physical terms, the natural, it may look like we are. What's the joke I once heard? The manager of the Chicago Cubs when I was a kid, Leo DeRocher, was famous for saying, "Nice guys finish last."
Right.
And somebody else said, "Yeah, but we're just running a different race."
Well, we are, and I'll never know if I've had any impact for the Lord until I'm in heaven. And I'm not concerned about that because I can't afford to be. That's, day to day, you just do what you believe is what God would have you do. Unfortunately, there was an illustration that Ray Stedman used years ago. I think I put it in the book. And it goes something like, wanted to know how his day was going. And he goes to this guy that was in this room or whatever. He knocks on the door and, "How's your day going?" And the implication was that eventually, the guy rings a tuning fork, and the tuning fork, he doesn't say any words. He just plays the tuning fork, and then he backs out, and then he says, "How's your day going? Good, bad, or indifferent?" And then he rings the tuning fork again. The point being, and I'm not doing a very good job here, is that over the years, the tuning fork hasn't changed in its tune. God's word has not changed since it was written. God is God, and he has a plan. And we're supposed to be a tuning fork in this world in which we live. We're supposed to be consistent. Yes, the world is getting worse, it seems. People don't listen to us. But we're supposed to be on the same tune. We're supposed to have the same message. His word hasn't changed. This is what his word says. It's just like Romans 1. Romans 1 is today's world. And Paul points out, this is today's world. I've seen that, and yet I'm called to be a tuning fork and to be consistent and to be reflective of Christ in a lost world. And it gets worse every day as I see people falling in their own self-interest. They're persuaded by the money or whatever to go in the direction that is just appalling. So I think that Christians, we need more Christians to come to Washington. We need more men and women that love the Lord to be witnesses in the media. We need people to influence their members of Congress. The evil side is there in droves, and we just kind of sequester ourselves back at our home, comfortable. If I don't make any waves, they won't come after me. One day they're going to come after us. And when they come after us, it's not going to be pretty. We need to be valiant for the Lord, and yet I don't know that, even the churches, I look at the Barna surveys,
Yes.
and what is it, 4% or 5% of self-professed believers in Jesus Christ have a biblical worldview? They make decisions based upon God's word? That's appalling. Just think if we had 50 or 75%, we would really, turn this place totally around. But the only salt that's out there is 4% in today's world. And as a result, we have some real issues. That's why we have transgender bathroom issues. That's why we have terrible racist issues. That's why we have all of this stuff. Because we've lost sight of who we are and what we ought to be doing.
It's tough to work up a good righteous anger about things when you don't know what you're supposed to be angry about.
Well,
don't know enough Bible to know what to do.
Absolutely. How many people even darken the Word of God on a regular basis and apply that in their lives? What does God have in mind for me today? I get convicted every time they open it up in the morning. And I fail consistently.
As do we all.
But it's important that we do. And wherever you are, you ought to be doing the things that God has called you to do, easier or not. And most of the time, if he's called you to do it, it's because he wants you to do it, and he didn't say it's going to be easy.
No. Jesus said we would face tribulation.
Absolutely.
Had somebody we were members of a church with in St. Louis say that she wished she could hear from God the way the prophets of the Old Testament did. I said, did you read about their lives? Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Elijah? Lord, kill me because I'm the only one left and now they're coming after me. Yeah. That was not an easy path. But again, Jesus didn't promise us an easy path. But as Paul wrote, the trials that we have in this life are as nothing compared to the glory that is to come.
I don't want to be like Thomas and say, I have to put my hand in his side. I have to see the nail prints in his hand. But Christ was compassionate, and he did that. He showed him. And what did he do? He not only left after that, but Thomas went to Nineveh, Mosul today, all the way into India.
To India, right.
And these disciples died in horrendous circumstances, but here they were faithful to the Word of God. We need Christians to do the same thing in today's world. They don't have to be pastors. They just have to be followers of Christ. And we need a lot of them in Washington because right now the enemy's in charge. And until we get Christians that care about this country, that care about obedience to Christ, I don't see anything going in the right direction.
It's a warning we should all heed. And let me just say this, Bob, knowing that you have Fox News and other major media outlets asking for your time that you graciously give, it is really appreciated by me and by all of us here at Skywatch TV that you're willing to get on Skype from time to time with us here in our little town in Missouri, and we truly appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Derek.
It is an honor. The book is The Deeper State. Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis is the author, and we thank you for watching. This is Off the Record. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is Skywatch TV. Good evening. This is Skywatch TV Off the Record. Tonight, our guest, the author, best-selling author of the book, The Rabbi Who Found Messiah, his brand new book from Defender Publishing, Gods and Thrones, Nakash, Forgotten Prophecy, and The Return of the Kingdom. We welcome Pastor Carl Gallups to our studio.
Thank you so much, Derek. It's good to be with you.
We're going to talk about the book and broadcast programs that people will have seen already. So this program, we're going to look at some other aspects of your ministry, maybe even your life, some things that you've been involved in outside of the book Gods and Thrones. First of all, probably people who followed you for a long time are aware of this, but Skywatch TV viewers may not know that you have not been a pastor your entire adult life. You actually spent a good bit of your post-childhood, post-childhood as a law enforcement officer.
No, that's right. No, I started very young, so it's post-childhood. You're right.
Yeah.
Actually, I was told by the Florida Department of Corrections, the prison system for the state, by the personnel director. He came out to the prison at which I was hired as a correctional officer. This is how I started my law enforcement career, and I was with the state prison system just for a year.
So basically, a prison guard.
Yes, but let me tell you how this worked. In those days, in Florida, they still had the chain gang. And so I was hired at what was called a road prison, and I've always been blessed. I was very athletic, and I looked a little more mature for my age. I was married at a young age, and so I was already married. I was in college at Florida State. I'm kind of a big dude, you know, and they had just changed the law back then to 18 is adulthood, and so it was almost a quota thing. They were trying to get qualified 18, 19, 20-year-olds in law enforcement work back in those days. Now I think they've jacked it up again. But so because of all these things I had going for me, I mean, how many 18-year-olds do you know that are married in college and, you know, and athletic kind of build for law enforcement? So I was snatched up quickly. And I blessed, my wife was valedictorian of our class. I was an honor student. So, you know, we had the intelligence to do all of these things and be in college. So I was hired at the age of 18. And the personnel director came out to the prison one evening, I remember, because I happened to be the first officer that walked out of the office as he pulled into the parking area. He got out, and I was in uniform, and he says, "I need to see Officer Carl Gallops." And I said, "You're talking to him." And he looked at me and he says, "You're not 18. And I said, "Well, what do you think?" He said, "You're in your 20s. I said, "No, sir, I'm 18. And he said, "Well, I wanted to come out and see the state of Florida's first 18-year-old correctional officer." And I said, "For the whole state?" And he said, "Yes, you're the first 18-year-old we hired." So I started at 18. Just a couple of years later, I was hired as the first 20-year-old deputy sheriff in a particular county, and I worked a little over 11 years in the field of Florida law enforcement, including my brief stint with the Florida State Prison System, guarding chain gang convicts on the side of the road, literally with a shotgun, and at the age of 18, and doing inside prison work as well. But anyway, I started as a deputy sheriff and then wound up working with 2 different sheriff's offices in the state of Florida for the rest of those 11 years. And in one of the sheriff's offices, we did our own criminal investigations as well, and we would assist each other, and we had one criminal investigator that assisted with us, etc. That was a long time ago. So I got a lot of criminal investigation experience as well, which I value. So anyway, so that's how my law enforcement career started. And at Florida State, my degree was centered towards criminal justice, criminology. I really wanted to continue and to pursue that career in law enforcement. And I always say this kind of tongue-in-cheek now, and ashamedly, I say, but the Lord messed it up. No, because I was saved at about 16 years of age and very serious and committed. And for most of my law enforcement career, I was extremely committed to the Lord. But there were a few years there, I'm not making excuses, but between going to school full-time, working full-time, shift work, and all the busyness of life, having our first child, kind of fell out and fell away from being in church every Sunday. And by the way, being in the house of the Lord every chance you get does make a difference. It really does, because I mean, I didn't go off into debauchery, but I just really several years just got way away from the Lord. But when I came back to the Lord, had a really powerful experience of recommitment and understanding that, look, I started a good start, I need to finish this. So as I'm moving along, I'm very involved in my church. My wife and I both, we were teaching Sunday school with children first, and then into the youth age, and I started doing some teaching with young people, and then doing some preaching at some retreats and conferences, and over some time I really felt a calling upon my life to be in full-time ministry. But here's the thing, I was a Jonah. I'm ashamed of it now, but I tell the story because I want people to know that you can love the Lord, you can be in church every time the doors are open, you can be serving the Lord, You can be teaching and preaching and still be running from something the Lord is calling you to do.
Yeah.
And I did that. I kept that calling, which was such a huge thing in my life. There's only been a few times in my life when I felt like I heard the audible voice of God, not necessarily in the air, but in my chest, you know, and just like this command or this directive that I couldn't have dreamed up. I didn't want to be a preacher, but I hear this command in my chest, you know, that you are to preach the word. You are to do this with your life. And I ran from that for 2 years, Derek. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't want to. I couldn't imagine. You know, I kept thinking, how am I going to stand up in front of people Sunday after Sunday for the rest of my life, and Wednesday night and Sunday morning and Sunday night? I'm thinking along the lines of pastoring. And I mean, I'll run out of stuff to say the first couple of months. Now I'm ashamed of even thinking that, because now I have a plethora of stuff that I want to preach and never can get to. There's just so much. The world's changing so rapidly. We're living in such prophetic times, and I don't have enough time or enough pulpits or enough microphones to say everything I want to say. But that's how it all happened. I mean, I started in law enforcement. My wife and I married. We knew each other since we were 10 or 11 years old. We married right out of high school, both of us going to college and jobs and careers. We just knew we wanted to be together. And by the way, we're still together all these years later. Yeah. So it's been a great ride, but there was that time in there when, in the middle of serving the Lord, I was running from Him. But I can remember to this day, it would mean nothing to you or your audience, but I can take you, I know the car I was in with my wife. I can take you to the stretch of highway when I was on. We were riding home one afternoon together, and I looked at her and I said, I've got something to tell you, and I don't know how you're going to react to this. Now, she's a very godly woman and has been long before I was a godly man. She was raised in a very godly family.
It's funny how that usually works in our lives of men.
I know,
you know?
and yet we knew each other since we were children. But anyway, she married me anyway. I fooled her. But, and don't we all? Yeah. But we were riding down the road, and I said, I don't know if this is going to freak you out. Don't know how if you're going to respond, because I mean we had home and property, good jobs, you know, school and careers going. My wife was personnel director for the governor's office of the state of Florida for 8 years. She was hiring and firing people for the governor. I mean, smart woman, very sharp, office management, et cetera, personnel matters. My career in law enforcement is going up the scale. Some political ambitions and aspirations as well. All of that's moving that way. And then I look at my precious wife going down the road. Basically, I'm saying to her, if we do this, we're going to have to leave everything and start all over, because a call to ministry is a call to prepare. And I'm going to have to go to seminary. I mean, I really want to make sure that I do this correctly and that I know what I'm talking about. So I lay this on my wife, that this is a calling from the Lord. Here was her answer. She looked at me and she said, I was wondering when you were going to tell me that. I thought she was going to like blow up, and I'm not doing that, you know. And she says, now I'm going to tell you something. She said, the Lord spoke to my heart when I was a little girl that I would be a pastor's wife. And she says, I'm ready to go. She says, that calling's been on my life for as long as I can remember. I couldn't believe it. She hadn't shared that with me before because she didn't want to falsely put me in some kind of direction or pressure.
Right.
And even though we were serving the Lord, we weren't going anywhere near me being a pastor and her being a pastor's wife. And then when we went to the seminary, we were looking at several seminaries. When we went to the seminary, which I would obtain my Master of Divinity degree, the seminary as a prospective student and put us up in a room there on the campus so that we could spend the day just walking around the campus. We were in the room. We were standing at the window looking out over the seminary campus, and my wife, she wasn't boo-hooing, but she had tears running down her cheek. And I said, what's wrong? She said, this is the very room I was standing in when the Lord spoke to me and said I would be a pastor's wife.
Wow.
And it was like when she was a young teenager. I said, how was that? She said that her youth minister brought the entire youth group on a trip. It was all day, all night, 2 or 3 days, to that seminary. He had some connections there, and they had gone, and that was the room she stayed in. I said, Oh my gosh. But to see, why should that surprise us? These are the kind of things
Right,
the Lord
right.
will do and can confirm. So that's how, I mean, people ask me, listen, you just asked me a question that almost everybody asks me when they get to know me. How'd you go from being a cop to a preacher? And I always tell them, it's not near as much difference as you think as you might think it is.
Well, let me ask you about that, because
Yeah.
that's something that I've had the opportunity to talk to a couple of fellows who came out of the law. One was an attorney. He was a JAG in the military.
Yeah.
And another is a local pastor here who also still works as a police officer. So he's still
Yes.
doing it full time.
Yes. And I've met several others like that.
How did your law enforcement career either prepare
Yes.
or influence your approach to ministry?
In so many positive ways. I could have never dreamed it before, but now that I've done them both, and now that I've been immersed at the point of this particular episode, over 30 years in ministry, 31 years in one church as a pastor.
Hickory Hammock Baptist Church?
It's called Hickory Hammock Baptist Church.
Right.
I know that's an odd name for some people to put their tongue around, but it's the name of a road. So, you know, Thomas Road Baptist Church,
Sure,
well,
sure.
ours is Hickory Hammock Baptist Church. You know, in the area where I live in, that's in the Northwest Florida area, that's a major thoroughfare to the beach. So all the people in that area know that road, and so when they built the church, they said, name it after the road. Everybody will know where it is.
Sure.
Never dreamed that their pastor would be all over TV and radio having to explain it every time. But yes, because you envision this little clapboard church with
Sure.
a hammock swinging in a hickory tree out front.
Yeah.
But that's not it. It's the name of the road. Hickory Hammock Baptist Church, Milton, Florida, is where I'm pastoring now. But the transference from law enforcement to ministry was not nearly as strange or as odd or as different or as weird as people might think. Now, I did have to shift. I did have to ask the Lord to give me this, because as a cop, and I was a good cop, really. I mean, the Lord blessed me. I enjoyed my job. I was decent to people. I won several commendations of valor and meritorious service and Law Enforcement Officer of the Year award. So, I mean, I really was a good cop and was recognized for it. But still, you know, you're trained as a cop to kind of be suspicious of everything and everybody. In a good way, but you have to be profiling. You have to profile. And I don't mean racially profile. I mean, you have to know how to size people up.
Well, that's a segment of the population that you see most often.
Yes.
The ones who need to be.
That's my point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm almost always, not always, but a good chunk of a law enforcement officer's career is spent with people who are not that decent, you know.
Not law-abiding.
They're murderers or rapists or robbers or thugs or B&E artists, and you know, and so not all of them, of course. There are a lot of law enforcement duties that you spend in very positive arenas of protection and at big events and traffic control and those things. And plus you get to help people at crime scenes a lot, families and stuff. So, but I'm just saying that a lot of your life is spent with the criminal element, and tracking down the criminal element and trying to prevent crime and all of those things. So I did ask the Lord, I said, you know, if I'm going to be a pastor, because this is where I felt the Lord was really calling me to at least begin, and that's where I still am. I said, Lord, you know, I can't be suspicious, because I'm going to have to deal with people who are hurting, who are broken, and that'll be drug abusers and alcoholics and people with records, and, you know, and then, you know, business people and stuff, and you think, well, they're the salt of the earth, but then you find out they've got past or they've got hurts, or sometimes they'll get involved in things that they shouldn't. And so I can't be a cop pastor. I have to be a pastor who will build upon the things you taught me as a cop. And so that's what I think the Lord has done. And so it was really positively, it has really positively influenced my ministry, I think, and I've had my church members tell me this too, so I think what I'm going to say is valid, because it has made me, those years in law enforcement, inside of a prison, out on the road with a chain gang, and then as a patrol officer and criminal investigator in 2 different sheriff's offices, it's made me, I think, not perfect, but a really good discerner of people, and whether or not somebody's telling you the truth or not. And it has also made me, I have kind of a sheepdog personality. You're familiar with that? Yeah. You know, just as a cop, I just, you know, I want to serve and protect. And of course, you know, as a husband and father and now a grandfather and a pastor for years, and watching generations of kids, holding them in my arms when they're born, and now they're 30 years old with kids of their own. I know their kids. I held them in their arms. I probably married their parents. And so I just feel, I got little kids running around my church calling me Pastor Pawpaw, you know. So I'm one of those kind of guys, you know, you mess with my kids, I'll kill you. You know?
Yeah.
And a lot of that just comes from the whole way I was raised. I mean, 18 years old, right on through as all of, prison and cop and investigator to pastor and generations of children and people and families. And so I think that 10 or 11 years really helped me to develop those people skills. Plus, I'll tell you something else it did. This is nothing negative about guys that go from high school or college right into the ministry. Mm-hmm. A lot of those guys are powerhouses and anointed by God. Mm-hmm. But some struggle because they've never been down in the trenches with people.
In the same way, politicians can't relate to people who are out there in the real world.
Sometimes, that's right. Yeah. And so when I stepped in that pulpit for the first time, I was 31 years of age, but a good, mature 31, because the 11 years before it, I had been in law enforcement and married and having my family and in school and my wife hiring and firing people for the governor's office. So we were a mature 31. But at 31 years of age, when I stepped into that pulpit, I had a life experience that very few pastors have. As a matter of fact, when I was doing my psychological evaluation coming into seminary, and they did them back in those days, I don't know if they do now, but I had to go through a whole psychological eval. And the guy told me, he said, this is amazing. He says, we're admitting more and more people like yourself into seminary now. People are coming in at the age of 28, 29, 30, 31, instead of 18 or 19. Mm-hmm. And he said they're coming out of life experiences. One guy came in with me that owned a truck stop. I came out as a cop. We're going into seminary together. We graduate together. He with a doctor's degree, we with my Master of Divinity. He went on to be the president of the University of Mobile in Mobile, Alabama,
wow.
a renowned Southern Baptist university. I wound up serving on the Board of Regents there at his request. I went straight into ministry and pastoring all these years. A truck stop owner and a cop. But he knew a lot about people. I knew a lot about people. He knew a lot about management and administration. I knew a lot about getting into people's lives and dirt and hurt and helping to heal. And so that's how God's doing. And the guy that did the psychological eval told us, he said, God's doing something. He said in the next few decades, this world or this nation is going to go through something. He said, God's doing something because he's bringing these kind of people more and more into seminaries. And so like you said, people that came out of law enforcement or law background and business background, they're going into ministry. And now here we are decades later, and boy, is God doing so. Look at the world we're living in.
Yeah.
We're living in the most prophetic time since the first coming of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who are involved in the front lines of ministry have come out of real world, real life experience. So it's helped me. I came out of a world, I didn't come into the pulpit at 31 as an immature 31-year-old that didn't know anything about life. I came there with 11 years of marriage behind me, children, college, career, Master of Divinity degree, and 11 years of dealing in the trench levels with people. It really helped. It really helped me and the church and I to gel together. It's made a good marriage. So I think the Lord has used all of that.
It was really an honor and a blessing to speak to your son Brandon, who is working with people coming out of or trying to get out of addictions.
Yeah. And my son's never been a victim of addictions, but he just has a wisdom and a heart for that,
right?
And an anointing,
and a discernment, a discerning spirit to be able to identify, I think, the spiritual causes of these types of traps that lure people into self-destructive behaviors.
Yes.
As an officer of the law, a police officer who saw people inside and outside the prison system, how did that experience sharpen your discernment about the activity of the principalities, powers, thrones, dominions that impact our natural world?
Listen, very much so. But I can tell you that while I was in law enforcement, I wasn't as keenly aware of it as I am now, of course. But because I had confronted literal demonic in law enforcement, and I mean, I could take an hour and tell some stories of literally walking into criminal scene situations where somebody's voice would change and the family around them would say, "What's that? What's happening? We've never heard that before." And I even had one suspect in a crime that literally changed voices on me, pointed to me and said, "I know who you are," when I walked in the door. And I was a born-again believing Christian. I'm walking in the door with badge, gun, uniform, patrol car, blue lights going. And it was
And what
this
that entity was
demonic-
seeing was
Yes.
what the spirit that
The
was
spirit.
in you. Yeah.
Yes, and I just got chill bumps remembering it right now
Yeah.
because it was so vivid, and the family said, "What's happening, officer? What's happening?" And I had a few moments to witness a little bit about what it more than likely was, but I didn't want to freak them out. I didn't know where they were spiritually. I wasn't there to preach. I was there to deal with a crime. But there it was. There was this entity. And so I had to deal with that several times, taking people that were completely whacked out on drugs and they had been involved in horrendous crimes and taking them into the psych unit or to the hospital or whatever. They went into these demonic rages and cursing and spitting at me and calling my names. And they didn't even know me, yet the demonic inside of them did. And knew who I was and what I was doing as a minister of the gospel, and would say all kind of vile things. So, I mean, how would they know that? So yes, this didn't happen all the time. I don't want your audience to think this was a daily thing. But in my 11 years, inside of prisons and in the law enforcement, at the street level, I've had experiences, a good handful that I can remember vividly. Well, I was able to bring that experience. I mean, how many pastors start brand new in a church that have already had that kind of experience
Probably
of
not me.
face-to-face with the demonic in very real and professional ways. So I was blessed in that way too. So the Lord, I think, has given me a special discernment there. But my son, you're right, Brandon, seems to have even a richer anointing in that area than I do. And God has just blessed him like that. And he has a huge heart for that.
Yeah.
And he's affiliated with a ministry right now that's moving that forward in his life. I'm very proud of that. Thank you for mentioning that.
Well, no, I know I could see it when you talk about him, when the two of you interact.
Yeah, we do a lot of ministry together now, and I mean, that's really exciting for me.
Let's talk about, I guess, continue with the law enforcement theme here.
Yeah.
You've, over the years, come to be friends with a law enforcement officer who many Americans know, even though we don't live in his jurisdiction, the former sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona, Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
Yes, he's a dear friend of mine.
How did you come to know him, and then how did you come to be deputized by him?
Yes, okay. Well, thank you for asking that. It's interesting. Again, I've been in one church for 31 years as the pastor down on the Gulf Coast, and there is a radio station there, and the owner, Mike Bates is the owner, who 17 years ago, allowed me, he asked me, I didn't even solicit him, but he got to know me, and he said, "Man, you need to be on the radio." And I said, "Really? Thank you." And he gave me airtime, and this is a secular station, but it's news talk. But he said, "Look," he said, "I don't want you coming on here and preaching, take up offerings and all that." I said, "Well, I don't want, I wouldn't do that." He said, but be a pastor and come on and talk about what's going on in the world and give some spiritual element and biblical element. Take some phone calls and, let people debate you and all that. And I said, "Cool, that's great." And ask the preacher live, a Christian Rush Limbaugh,
That's it, yeah.
I said, "Yeah, that's great." So 17 years ago, 15, I can't remember the date right now, but it's a good while ago, we started that. Well, it built and built, and then in the midst of that, the station upgraded to 25,000 watt station. It's the most powerful AM station on the Gulf Coast, and then, of course, in those days, the internet was really proliferating, and then live streaming, and all the radio apps that you can get stations all over. So the station just upgraded to all of that. My program became syndicated without having to go through the hassle of syndication. And then, of course, we had websites, and we were podcasting and live streaming, and plus we already had a powerful radio station. So the show just went international because we were also marketing it, I was, and the people with the PNN News and Ministry Network that I started on the internet. And that was viral with millions and millions of views on our YouTube channels alone and all the other social media we were using. So the show just took off. And then nationally renowned and internationally renowned people wanted to be on the show.
Yeah.
So in the midst of that, this whole Obama birth certificate investigation that was opened up by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Now, this is an interesting story. I've got to tell you this because I was just talking to Mike Zullo the other day about this, and he knows this story, and so does the sheriff. This is another God story, because while I was on the radio when Obama was running for office the first time in 2007, I had a caller call in and said something about, well, he's not even from here, and he doesn't have a valid birth certificate. And I didn't believe that, because I'm in this constitutional law and order, law enforcement, raise my right hand, defend the Constitution.
Sure.
I'm still apple pie, Chevrolet, hot dogs, you know. And I told the guy on the radio, I said, I doubt that. They're not going to let somebody take the office of the White House and be the commander-in-chief
Right.
that doesn't even have a valid birth certificate. Because I didn't know anything about this issue. So I wasn't rude to the guy, but I was just saying, no, you need to check that out. And he was saying, you need to check it out. So I thought about it. I said, okay, just another nut. You know, and I'm not quick to judge people as nuts, but that just sounded so far out to me. So I hung up the phone, took other calls, and we went on. Well, a few weeks later, somebody else said it. And then I said, I'm going to check this out. So I started doing a little research on the internet, and there seemed to be a modicum of possibility of truth to the whole issue from people who were doing their own research back in those days. Well, anyway, back in 2011, a billionaire businessman, contractor, builder, architect by the name of Donald Trump,
Right.
who wasn't even running for president, was cajoling and badgering then President Barack Obama, because at that point, Barack Obama had locked down all of his identifying documents, spent $1.7 million, and had some little short form birth certificate up on the website because people were asking him to produce, because this rumor was going around that he's not even from here. And so he put this little short form of it. Well, it really wasn't valid, and there were some real problems with the way that was presented. People were already attacking that, so Donald Trump comes out and kind of poking him in the chest, saying, just put something, if you're from here, it's no big deal. Cost you $15 and 10 minutes of your time for your lawyer to make a phone call and put a birth certificate up.
Exactly.
So that went on, you know, for several weeks, and finally one day a long-form birth certificate appears on the website. Well, within minutes, so-called experts, and some of them I think were pulling it down. It was a PDF file, and they were examining it and saying, oh my gosh, this is a total fabrication.
There's metadata involved. There are layers involved.
Layers and all
things you
this
can
stuff.
tell if you're an expert at,
Yes.
forensics when it comes to
Yes, forensics.
Right.
Information that shouldn't have been there in the 60s but was on this one because he was born in the 60s. So all of this was coming out on the internet. Well, I didn't become a full-fledged birther at the point. I didn't know where the guy was born, but now I've been a cop for 11 years. And you know, where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And there were just so many questions. Again, I made it as simple as this for folks. I said, look, let's pretend like I was elected president, a cop from Florida. And everybody went, oh my gosh, I don't know if this guy's for real. I don't even think he's from here. I could solve that in a day. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure,
So
yeah.
easy. Now, I wouldn't go around locking my documents down. I wouldn't go around sealing every record. And if I did, maybe I just didn't want people delving into all my personal life and dragging it out. I get that. And I gave him a little leeway for that. But the birth certificate? That's innocuous.
You're
Either
right.
you're born here or you're not.
Yeah.
You know, so, but there was such a big deal over it. And then the short form went up, and it had so many problems, they took it down. And then with the cajoling of Donald Trump, here comes a long form. It's riddled with problems, or at least so went the accusations. And I just said, this thing stinks. Something's going on. So as a radio guy and a pastor, but a past cop, I just started addressing it and looking at it, not full-blown birther, but just asking, getting people
Right.
to answer questions, common sense questions. Well, in the meantime, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, at the same time, I knew of him, but didn't know him personally then, had been petitioned by a large constituency of his, forgive the redundancy, constituents,
Yeah.
a large sector of his constituents is the way I should have said it. He was petitioned to investigate the birth certificate because they were afraid that maybe Maricopa County had been been the subject of fraudulent election if
Right.
if they were asking to vote for a candidate who might not even have valid citizenship. That was their question, you see. And Sheriff Arpaio, now I can tell you, I have since become good friends. His phone's on my cell phone. We called each other just the other day, as a matter of fact. And his chief investigator, Mike Zullo, we're all very close now. But back in the day, I just knew him from TV. And he, I can tell you this now, he did not want to deal with that. He thought, like me, he said, surely they're not. He was a former DEA district supervisor of the western United States before he was 6-term sheriff of the 4th largest sheriff's office. He served in Mexico as a supervisor, in the Middle East with the DEA.
Wow.
I mean, this guy's got credentials that long, and he was like me. He's apple pie, Americana, Constitution, and he was telling everybody, yeah, of course he's not. His birth certificate's legitimate, and they wouldn't let him be the president if it wasn't. But the citizens kept doing it. So The sheriff put together what he called back then his cold case posse. Mike Zullo, the chief investigator, he went to Mike Zullo and said, I want to be the person to put this thing to rest. He said, I'm tired of hearing it at every rally I go to. They want me to investigate the birth certificate. Because he was known as America's toughest sheriff, you know, and they were saying, all right, if you're so tough, you be the one to investigate this. And he said, I don't have jurisdiction. That's a federal. And they said, yes, you do. We could have been frauded. And he, you know, you're right. Okay. So he gets them together. He gives it to Mike. He says, look, do your best to prove that this is truth. And by the way, that's the way you start a criminal investigation. If there's a criminal investigation and you're accused of maybe being a suspect, one of the things I'm going to try to do is to try to clear you. Because if I can, then I can move on to somebody else. And not illegally try to clear you. I mean, just where were you, what you doing, you have witnesses, and if I can say, well, you know, it couldn't have been Derek, then we can move on. But if I try to clear you, and I can't, now you're a person of interest, or maybe a suspect. So that's what the sheriff said. He said, clear this, clear it. He said, I can't even believe this. 2 or 3 days later, the team comes back with Mike Zullo. He said, sit down, Sheriff. He said, this is messed up. He said, we can't clear it. There are some forensic anomalies here that are horrendous. And the sheriff said, oh my gosh, what have we done? What have we found? And so a 5-year investigation ensued. Now watch this. Just a
5-year investigation.
Eventually, yeah. But just a few months after them taking the case, they did back-to-back news conferences, hour-long each, where they were presenting their evidence, because back in those days, again, naive that we all were, Sheriff Arpaio, myself, everybody, you bring this before the cameras, and the mainstream media would go berserk, Congress would go berserk, federal courts would go berserk, said, oh my gosh, we've got a constitutional travesty, what do? We've got somebody using fake ID to command the military. I mean, you know, that's what we would think.
Right.
So all the evidence is presented. The only thing, most of the media didn't even show up, and the ones that did, they looked at Sheriff Arpaio and said, what authority do you have to do this investigation? He pulled his badge off, and you remember that famous shot. He said, this is my authority. And he said, what are you doing asking me that? Why aren't you asking me about this? They wouldn't. It was surreal. I mean, I can remember feeling that big back then, thinking, we've either been taken over, or we're in the process of being taken over, or something bad has happened to America. How can the sheriff of the 4th largest sheriff's office do a forensic criminal investigation months long, call news conferences before the war? He's not hiding anything. He's not manipulating anything. He's ready to bring all it forward and give it to them. And Congress do this. And the news media go like this. How can that happen? And the courts refused to hear the case. People tried to get it into the courts. Nope, nope, nope. None of that was ever heard by any court on its merits. Yeah. The courts were just shoving, well, that's Congress's job. And you take it to Congress, so that's the court's job.
As I recall, there was an attorney who was a Democrat who tried to bring it up and was told that he didn't have standing. And so it was dismissed because he didn't have standing.
There was all of that about standing and then jurisdiction, because the courts would say, well, the Constitution says Congress is supposed to handle it. And by the way, that's the truth. The Constitution says that Congress is to determine the eligibility of the person who the Electoral College brings. It says it in the Constitution. They never once vetted him.
So,
yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I've got a question here, though.
Ask it. Well, and then I'll continue with my story, because it's fascinating. At least it is to me. but no, everybody I tell it to when I'm getting ready to tell you this God story part of it.
Well, let's get to that then, because the other question I've got gets into some speculative territory here, and again draws on your and maybe starts to lead back toward the topic of your book, which again we'll point out available from Defender Publishing, and if you've got this, you probably already have the book. But
and I do want to take the conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat, nut job specter off of this, because I never was that, even though I was tagged as that, and that was a part of the obfuscation plan. No, a former cop asking cop questions, and then you got a sheriff with all those credentials and his investigator with all his investigative credentials conducting this investigation, and at first with a posse of lawyers and ex-cops and retired cops and all that, and they're coming to the conclusion this thing stinks to high heaven, at least warrants a congressional hearing. Because Congress can subpoena, Department of Health and Hawaii and everything, and they can subpoena witnesses. They can have that thing, they could have it settled in a few days. Never to this day have they ever touched it yet. But anyway, so the God story is this. When they did those first few news conferences in 2011, I'm watching it on video. I think we had put it on our television set, but I remember sitting on the couch watching on a television set with my wife, and I'm watching Sheriff Arpaio and Mike Zullo. I had never met either one of them. My wife can testify to this. Several times we've remembered it together and talked about it. Sitting on the couch, I said to her, I've never met those two guys. I said, but the Lord is speaking to my heart that not only am I going to meet them, but I'm going to be intimately connected with them. And she just looked at me. She didn't think I was crazy, but she just, how can that be? But, you know, we'll see. And I said, yeah, we'll see. And I said, if it's not the Lord, then it's not going to happen. A few months later, I got some kind of connection. I don't remember if it was Mike Zullo that called me or whatever. We got hooked up. I had him on my radio show just to have him on to talk about all of this because it was hot and heavy back then. Mm-hmm. So I had him on my show, and I told him, I said, man, I used to be a cop, investigator, and you are. He said, oh, really? Okay, cool. And he just thought I was a radio guy. We started talking about it. The next thing you know, after the show's over with, I got him on the phone. I said, you know, you sound like a believer to me. Because just the way he was talking. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, I am. I said, well, I'm a pastor. And I said, can I pray for you, man? He said, my gosh, yes. He said, you're the first person ever done that. I said, sure. So we prayed over the phone. I figured I'd never hear from him again. Mm-hmm. Well, some weeks later, he called me back up and said, can I come back on your show? I got some more information. I said, sure. So I brought him back on the show. Next thing you know, CPAC is going on in Washington, D.C. I get a call. He said, look, we want you to meet Mike Zullo in Washington, D.C., and to help him go to some congressmen and try to get this into the hands of congressmen. That's another whole show. We'd have to have another hour to do that. But sure. I met him for the first time in the airport. The next thing you know, I'm getting hooked up with Sheriff Arpaio. The next thing you know, just like what was in my heart sitting on television, I'm involved with him. And then we get deep into this. 2016 in December, right before Sheriff Arpaio went out of office after 6 terms, he gave another hour-long conference with Mike Zullo. I was there. I went out to Phoenix, Arizona. But prior to that, in January 2016, I was asked to open the Donald Trump campaign rally in Florida.
Right.
And so I did. Sheriff Arpaio, also, who I was already close to, he says, come out here. I want to talk to you. He was then revealing to me in his office for 4 hours, and Mike Zullo, what was getting ready to come at the end of the year and where the investigation was going. And he says, I want to deputize you. And I thought he was kidding. You know, I said, yeah, right, man, you know. He said, well, no, you can't come out here and arrest anybody, but I want to literally deputize you with ID, badge, everything, special deputy, because we're going to tell you stuff that you got to take to your grave. And I need to hold you accountable. And you are also one of the major broadcasters that's putting this stuff out there, all over radio, internet, everywhere else, in the media, print media. And you need to be held accountable, and we need to be held accountable to you, that we're telling you the truth and not obfuscating around you. I said, okay. I said, I've been a cop. I know how this works. And so he deputized me. And until he went out of office that whole year, I mean, I was a special deputy, Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Not with arrest powers, but with the accountability to the sheriff for what I was saying and for what they were telling me and the information that I was privy to. So that's how I got connected to them. And I mean, it's just, and I'm telling you, with my wife as my witness, I knew it in my heart somehow, and it was so weird. I didn't, you know, you're thinking, is this the flesh? Am I just, I'm going to be connected to these? Why would I think that? Yeah. You know, is there in Arizona? I'm in Florida.
Other side of the country.
Other side of the country. How could I be connected to them? Next thing you know, I am, to the point of him putting a badge in my hand and holding me accountable, and in his office. And I was back to his office 2 or 3 times for hours and hours. The night before the news conference, they asked me to come out, and I spent several hours with his PR people and his investigators around the table in his private office, and we discussed the whole strategy for bringing all that forward, and then the media afterwards. So that's my connection to them, and I can tell you what they have uncovered is earth-shattering.
Can you disclose what that is?
Yes, some of it I sure can. In that conference, this has already been disclosed, and then some other things have been disclosed publicly since then, so I can say for this program. In that conference, it was demonstrated. I'm going to use the word we because it's easier to say that, but please, I'm not trying to pretend like I was the investigator. When I just say we, I mean as the special deputy and kind of the media guy, we knew these things. So what we now know and what was presented at that conference is that the long-form birth certificate that Obama had up on the White House website is a complete fabrication on a blank template from the ground up, which is 5 federal crimes. And I can tell you what they all are in a moment. And how we know this? Because we actually, in the course of this 5-year investigation, got a hold of a legitimate birth certificate of a woman by the name of Johanna Ani out of Hawaii. And in the course of investigation, just doing some comparison of different documents and different things, they came to this one and they noticed that there were a few things on this document that looked very similar to this one. And they got to examining it forensically. I mean, ink splatters, putting it under microscopes, putting it on digital and moving things around. They said, oh my word. And they discovered 10 elements on the Johanna Ani that were cut and pasted digitally onto a blank template because they were mathematically, they were skewed perfectly, logistically, everything moved onto this template. They were identical. Now, in case somebody's saying, well, that could just be a digital thing. Yeah, but when the birth certificate was done in the 60s, they were typed.
Right.
And so here's
a manual typewriter, which never are aligned perfectly. So you're right.
Never.
Yeah,
so here's an example of one of those 10 elements. And I understand there's been more since the 10 that were presented, that they've discovered even more now. But here's one example that'll help your audience visualize this. On the Johanna Ani document, there was a box where you check yes or no, and there's an X. There was an X that went outside the box, up top, and it hit the word above it, and so it kind of smeared into the word above it. Well, when you put that under forensic microscopes, ink splatters are like fingerprints. You can't, I mean, they're like snowflakes and fingerprints. Everyone is unique. And so we looked on Obama's, and not only was the X and the box lifted, but the word above it with the ink splatter was lifted and put on his in 2 places. So what's the chances of having that happen on this document exactly the same in 2 places?
Infinitesimal.
In one place, you would say, well, that's like winning the lottery, but it maybe could happen. But 2 places, the exact, and that's just one of 10 elements like that.
Wow.
And so when they discovered that, here's what they did. They sent all the information they had, and it's much more than all that, but they sent all of that to a digital document examination entity in Europe that trains European law enforcement officers and testifies in courts all over Europe. They're highly renowned. Sent it to them and said, prove us wrong. And that's all they've always wanted, is the truth. I mean, Sheriff Arpaio said this, we're not looking to see where he's born. This is not a birth issue. This is not a witch hunt. He told the people, clear him. I want to be the one to clear him. But then when they saw they couldn't, they said, we just want to know the truth. And they said to this document expert company, they told them, said, if we're wrong, tell us, show us. And they said, okay, we'll take it on. I mean, they wanted to be the ones to say, they're wrong, there's nothing to this. So they took it. Then they took it to one in the United States. The guy they took it to in the United States is a Democrat who is a big supporter of Obama, but he owns this big company, and he's written books, and he trains law enforcement, and he testifies in courts, and so he's got a reputation in business. And he told him, he says, yeah, he says, now I'm not going to do anything that's going to hurt my president. And they said, that's why we want you to do it, because we desperately want you to prove us wrong. But to protect the integrity of your business, you better tell us if we're right too. And he said, well, of course I will. He said, you know, this is my livelihood. He said, but I don't think it's going to be a forgery or fake or whatever. So they sent it to him. They didn't tell either one. They didn't tell these guys this one's looking at it. They didn't tell this guy these looking at it. So it's kind of double blind. Within the amount of time, I think it's 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks, whatever, that signed affidavits came back from both companies. Both of them reached the same conclusion: an absolute forgery built from the ground up on a template. And the guy in the United States, when he saw the X thing, he said, and this is the nail in the coffin. Those were his words in his affidavit. He said, this X, this other stuff is for sure, but this X, this is impossible, absolutely impossible. This is the nail in the coffin. It was manufactured from Johanna Ani's document. And they both said at least there's probably more documents that were used to cut and paste to build this certificate. Now, I'm telling you, doesn't that sound surreal that information would be presented by the 4th largest sheriff's office, and Congress has yet to look at it? Well, Department of Justice has yet to look at it. Media has yet to examine it.
Exactly, and that leads back to the question that I had alluded to before, and this will be our last question here as we wrap up. It almost sounds as though you bring this information forward and it just falls dead, like you know, trying to make a sound in a vacuum, you know, because there's no air to carry the sound. Nobody hears it. It's almost as though there's a, what's the phrase they use in the television show Doctor Who, a perception filter that prevents people from seeing something. There's this this gray mist or black hole where something should be, that this document shows something happened here, but no one will look at it, no one can look at it. Something is obscuring or occulting,
Yes.
and I use that word deliberately, the vision of those who should look directly at it, and they just refuse to look. What do you think, if you had to speculate, that picture looks like, and what could be causing this sort of perception filter, physical, natural, or
Yes.
supernatural?
I think it's all of that. And of course, because we know what the scripture says, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against demonic powers in high places, principalities. But by saying it's not against flesh and blood, that intimates that we think it is. We see it in the flesh and blood. And so our warning is, deal with it in flesh and blood. If it's political, if it's government, if it's powers, if it's, militaries, whatever. Yes, you're living in the physical world. It's going to act out in the physical. It's going to play out in the physical. But always be aware that there's something very demonic and spiritual behind the wickedness that you're seeing before your eyes. Now, that was written 2,000 years ago in the book of Ephesians.
Yeah.
So, we take that whole spiritual warfare thing to think, well, I should be very careful not to eat 2 bowls of ice cream instead of 1, or, man, I stumped my toe and I was tempted to cuss. Boy, spiritual warfare was all over me. That's not what that passage is about.
Right.
It's about powers and principalities and darkness and high wicked places behind the thrones.
Gods and thrones.
Gods and thrones, the power. People ask me all the time, is this just another book on spiritual warfare? And I say, well, let me explain it like this. The phrase spiritual warfare is never used in this book. I didn't do that on purpose. I went back afterwards and did a word search. It dawned on me, it's not in there. But it's spiritual warfare on steroids because it explains from the Garden of Genesis to the book of Revelation what really happened in the garden all the way through to Revelation and what's really happening now. So back to your question, yes. I mean, Mike Zula is a believer. I'm a believer. And, we're professional about all this, but we're believers. We know what the Word says. We don't turn everything into a demon behind a rock because there are crimes being committed, we believe, and there are forgeries and fabrications being done. We understand that, and I've dealt with that in my law enforcement. But this is dark. This is national, international, global, geopolitical. I mean, think about it. If that truly is all fake, and again, it's not just me and the investigator saying it's 2 document expert, but if it all is, then you got to ask why. And the answers are not good. I don't care what answers you come up with to explain why that is. And as I said, 5 federal crimes have been committed to put that thing up there and use it as an identifying document. So does that mean an undocumented person was the commander-in-chief of the #1 super? Does that mean he has the nuclear codes? Does that mean all the negotiations he did with Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Middle East and all the Israel hating that was done and all that? What does that mean? You see, so lot of constitutional crisis, geopolitical questions, and I mean, I know that the people on the left that might watch this and hear me say this, they're immediately say, he's a nut, he's a conspiracy. No, I'm not. This is all looked at from a forensic element and given to forensic companies on the other side of the globe from each other who came back with the same thing we had found, not knowing what we were saying about it and not knowing what each other was saying about it. And no, this warrants investigation. And again, Mike Zula and our attitude right now, I mean, he's the investigator and the sheriff is, but I mean, as the media guy, our attitude is we just want the truth. If it goes before Congress and they subpoena the documents and it finally all clears up, the curtains pull back and we say, oh, we missed that or we misunderstood that, so it is legitimate. I'm fine with that. I don't have to be embarrassed because I've said all along, all we want is the truth, but we've never, ever had anybody examine all of the evidence. So, yes, I also, as a pastor and somebody who understands the Word of God and all the reading and writing and research and speaking and preaching and teaching and interviews I've done on the demonic, the prophetic times in which we're living, gods and thrones, the powers behind the thrones. Yeah, I believe there's something deeply spiritual to this.
Well, something there that's
deeply spiritual.
Dark enough and frightening enough to scare away some of the most powerful men and women on the planet.
That's my point.
Yeah, Congress of the United States won't touch it. Why?
How do you get,
somebody's intimidated. Somebody won't even look at it. What could be that powerful?
How do you get 500 and something congressmen to a T, every one of them say, I'm not touching it?
Right.
How do you get the entire media industry saying, I'm not touching it?
Yep.
How do you get the entire federal court system saying, I'm not touching that?
Yeah.
How do you get the entire military system to say, we're not going there?
Right.
How do you get the entire international political system saying, we're not going there?
Right.
How does that happen?
This is a pay grade above George Soros or the Koch brothers.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, and it gets deep and it gets dark. And I think there's something deeply demonic and spiritual connected to it, not just because of my experience in all of this, but also because I know what the Word of God says about these prophetic times we're living in. And I think it's connected.
Yeah. Carl Gallup's the author of Gods and Thrones and the very first guest in this new program here on Skywatch TV. Off the record, Carl.
Thank
an
you.
honor.
Thank you, Derek. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you for watching. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is Skywatch TV. Is the United States under the control of a shadow government that is devoted to Lucifer? And how are they responding to the presidency of Donald J. Trump? Welcome to Skywatch TV Off the Record. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me is the author of a new book that takes a look at these topics, goes deeper than geopolitics to something, we'll call it theopolitics. The new book is called Saboteurs. The author, Skywatch TV CEO, Tom Horn. Tom, welcome.
Hey, Derek, always great to be with you.
Conversation always educational and fascinating. Your book, Apollyon Rising, which then was updated to Zenith 2016, was eye-opening because it took a look at the United States and Washington, D.C. From a different perspective than most political observers are used to. Looked at the very shape of the city, our nation's capital, as part of a magical working. Before we get that deep into it, let's step back a little bit into what led to the book Saboteurs. What was it about Donald Trump, his election, and the response of the entrenched political class that motivated you to write the book?
Well, it wouldn't be one thing. It was really a series of things. First of all, the election of Donald Trump was so improbable, right? It definitely was not because he was a well-spoken politician, right, with many years of knowing how to do the language craft of Washington, D.C. He was an outsider. But that, I think, was even part of what has led to the saboteurs resisting him, because basically he declared war on the establishment cross-party monopoly of the rhinos and Democrats in Washington, D.C., the bureaucratic class. He did it in his inaugural speech. It's an amazing speech where basically he says for too long, Washington did all these things to benefit themselves, but the Americans didn't get to participate in it, the average guy. And that stops now, he said. Now we're going to take it back. We're going to give it to the working class. That was a declaration of war. You have to understand that, like in Washington, D.C., the average voter, they vote for a president every 4 years, and they vote for him based on the stuff that he has said during his campaign, represents ideas or changes they want, or tax policy or foreign policy or whatever. And he's their champion then that's going to go, Mr. Smith goes to Washington. He's going to go to Washington. He's got his big ideas. He's going to make a change. The average American doesn't understand the federal bureaucracy that's made up of 3.5 million people, many of whom are career, lifetime, federal employees, many of whom are holdovers of other administrations like the Obama administration. They're deeply entrenched in the D.C. liberal globalist worldview. They're opposed to things like, protecting the borders and all of that. They just see these as a waste of time and a restriction on what they think is the future world that we're moving into. So they're all kind of driven by an ideology that, at a deeper level, I believe, is an ancient scheme. And that's what the book Saboteurs does. It first acknowledges the idea of the federal bureaucracy. It's really vogue right now to talk about the deep state, right? And the shadow government, which is another thing that we've never seen anything like this before. Former presidents step aside whether they like the incoming guy or not, but they do what they think is right for the welfare of the nation, right? The peaceful transition of power from one party to another. Not now. Obama literally moved a mile away from the White House and set up what even people in the Beltway are calling a shadow third-term presidency, right? He's got his agitation outfit out there now with 20 or 250 offices nationwide. Literally tens of thousands of people are turning up in these marches. And he has said publicly that he's been heartened by the fact that they're marching against some of what Trump is trying to accomplish. So there definitely is, this part that is happening just where people that are political loggerheads, they're ideologically driven, they're opposed to what Trump represents. And to some extent, they're not willing to just wait out his 4 years in hopes that they can just get him out of office and now we can get back on the globalist mantra again, right? They feel threatened. But again, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, Ephesians, he says to the Ephesians something very important. In common language, he would say, at the end of the day, our real war is not with flesh and blood.
Humans.
Or
right.
even political differences, but rather the real battle is against principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world. And we do know that from time immemorial, you have Lucifer and those that are on the side of Lucifer. And you're seeing this again in the Trump administration, witches going out, binding ceremonies against Donald Trump. There is this supernatural element. And that was what I really wanted to get into in the book Saboteurs, but I wanted to go even deeper. And thanks to WikiLeaks and some of the things we can talk about in a moment, it became very apparent that there is a dark occultism that is at work here, that have their agenda is an ancient scheme to develop a new golden pagan age, right, under the rule of who the New Testament would call the Antichrist.
This is one of the things that's really fascinated me over the last couple of years here at Skywatch TV is how we'll look at the same subject from different angles and find that our research is overlapping without intending for it to happen that way. The golden age to which they want to return. This is something that you referenced in Apollyon Rising and Zenith 2016, the Kume Sibyl, and the return of a golden age with a child from heaven, and returns old Saturn's reign. And of course, Saturn was the ancient Greek god Kronos, head of the Titans, who were punished by being sent to Tartarus. And of course, we know from Peter that the angels in Tartarus were the watchers who descended on Mount Hermon.
That's right.
So we're looking at people who, whether they realize it or not, are in service of these old gods who are destined to return for a brief period in Revelation chapter 9. So we're looking at something way deeper, as you said, than just a political movement, something that this didn't begin with Barack Obama, in other words. This has been ongoing for a while. So looking at the research you did for this book and drawing on the research you've done in the past, how is this deep occultic state manifesting in the world today, and what are their goals? Why are they so opposed to Donald Trump?
Well, and again, you mentioned Donald Trump. He was the first president in U.S. history that actually had a Freemasonic ball held.
Barack Obama.
Barack Obama.
Right.
Barack Obama. Held in his honor. And, why would they do that? Because he represented for them a breakaway from American geopolitics as usual to a brand new kind of globalist agenda, which fits into their globalist scheme. How many people, most Americans have no clue that as many as 44 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons, but they weren't just American Freemasons. Their ideas came from a European model of Freemasonry that was based on the book The New Atlantis. And this is connected to this whole idea of a new golden pagan age. The New Atlantis represented, this time when the gods ruled with mankind on the earth. The gods were commingled with mankind. That's Atlantis. And Francis Bacon wrote a book called The New Atlantis, which encapsulated an idea that we were going to set forth a continent on the earth that was going to respect the gods again. This is why Manly P. Hall, the 33rd degree mystic who is so revered to this day, often talked about it in language of the Atlanteans, about commingling with the gods, and the fact that much of Earth's problems today are because we separated ourselves from these pagan gods. But if we rejoin with these gods and respect them again, they'll bring blessings upon the earth. It's really kind of the core of Freemasonry. And if you visit Washington, D.C. today, I'm going to be back there in November, and you stand in the U.S. National Mall, if you're unfamiliar with the kind of design of the city around you, it looks strange to you, right? It looks archaic. It looks like it's got bits and pieces out of ancient history, right? The U.S. Capitol Dome. If you visit the U.S. Capitol Dome and you go in and you stand and you look up into the underside of the ever-pregnant belly of Isis, what do you see? The apotheosis of George Washington, the famous painting by Brumidi. Apotheosis means to become a god. Well, what god is George Washington becoming? According to the records, he's becoming the Osiris, right? So that what they're doing there, they're embellishing a mystical idea. They're giving reverence to a mystical idea because they want the good graces of these gods. That's why most of the cornerstones of the buildings in Washington, D.C. and inside the capital city were all dedicated at particular times when the stars were in conjunction with the kind of heavenly signs that they associate with Osiris and Isis and Apollo. It was all very carefully done. Washington, of course, himself, a Freemason. There's famous paintings of him with his whole Freemasonic garb on, right?
Right.
But this is what they wanted. In fact, it's very interesting. If you go to the Library of Congress website and look up an article there. It's a very interesting article called The Competition, the most approved plan, the competition for the U.S. capital city. And it's on our own government webpage. Read that. It's very enlightening because it says that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they advertised for an engineering plan to all these big companies, not just in the U.S., but France and other places are advertising. Whoever can come up with the best layout for the U.S. capital city is going to win the engineering rights and get a lot of the contracts to do the work and so on. But according to our own government website, after all of the plans were turned in, George Washington and especially Thomas Jefferson rejected all these plans, and it explains why. It says because Thomas Jefferson wanted to shepherd a plan that would cause the layout of Washington, D.C. to be based on the old Roman pantheon, and it says dedicated to all pagan gods. That's exactly what they wanted. That's exactly what they built, and that's the reason why. When you stand in the U.S. Capitol, you have a giant obelisk, the largest of its kind in the world, facing the Capitol Dome, these patterns out of antiquity. And by the way, inside the U.S. Dome, where George Washington is becoming the Osiris, for people that say this country was built on Christianity, look into the heaven that he's rising into, because there's not a single Christian element in it. Jesus isn't there. Michael the Archangel isn't there. There are no Bible verses there. He is rising into a heaven that is made up of all pagan gods and even demons, including the god Vulcan, who Manly P. Hall said is the god that fills the Mason's hands with the seething energies of Lucifer. Now, right below that, Derek, right out of your book, right, The Great Inception, right below the apotheosis, guess what? 72 pentagrams. You have this Pythagorean binding utility right beneath George Washington for the very purpose of magically controlling, from their worldview, their Gnostic ideas, magically controlling the cosmocrators that still rule over the nations of the earth, to bind them, to constrain them to do your will.
Right.
Well, so you have a mix. What's very interesting, it's also on the Great Seal of the United States, you have this mix of Greek mottos, but Egyptian symbols, right? So you have the pyramid, the all-seeing eye, all that, but the mottos, Anavet Coeptus and Novus Ordo Seclorum, these are out of Greek. And in all of antiquity, you see this going back and forth, where the Egyptian earlier version of what would become Apollo was the god Osiris. The Greeks put their own spin on a lot of this, and even further back, by the way, they're talking about Nimrod, the ancient pagan giant, great hunter before God, who the Sumerians called Gilgamesh, the half man, half god, right? This legendary hero figure. But to compare it specifically to Washington, D.C., and to get below the surface here as to what these occult saboteurs in D.C. want and why they are so opposed to what the Trump administration represents, especially when it's, you know, raising any questions about Christianity and a prayer and asking his evangelical, you know, advisory board to give him advice. The reason they seethe over that is because in the heart of D.C., you have, just a little ways from the White House, you have the headquarters of the 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Now they do something there I'll mention in a moment at the inauguration of every president. But again, this goes to why D.C. is laid out the way that it is and how this is based on Egyptian mythology involving the god Osiris and his sister wife, the queen of magical skills, Isis. And of course, just briefly, the idea is that Osiris was this great god. Interestingly, 72 saboteurs,
right, led by his brother Set,
his
the
evil
god of
brother
chaos,
Set.
right.
So these are the gods that are in competition with each other, right? Nail him in a box, give him to Set. Set murders him, chops him into 14 pieces, throws the 14 pieces into the Nile River, where they float down the Nile. Some of them get hung up on the limbs of a tamarisk tree, according to the story. But Isis searches the banks of the Nile River. She recovers 13 of the 14 pieces. She can't find the 14th piece, which was his male organ, the phallus. So she creates a magic obelisk. Puts his, you know, whatever, sews his body back together, whatever it is she does, puts it all together, attaches this obelisk to his ithyphallic corpse, and then uses magic to draw the seed of Osiris from up out of the underworld through the testes of the obelisk, and uses it to magically impregnate herself. Then she gives birth to Osiris reborn, who's also called Horus, the son of Osiris. Now that magic was so important in antiquity that wherever you go in all of the ancient Egyptian ruins, you constantly run across these obelisks are everywhere. But so much so that when a new pharaoh was to become the king of Egypt, he would be taken on a barge during a festival called the Festival of Opet. He'd be taken on a barge up the Nile, where the laity are walking along on the banks of the river, and they're recreating the story of Osiris and Isis, right, on the banks. He winds up at the largest religious complex ever built, the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. And so at Karnak, he's taken inside the ever-pregnant belly of Isis, the dome, and he stands there facing the obelisk on the outside. And the Egyptian magicians, and this is something I would want people to think about, these magicians were very powerful. They had levels of sorcery we could barely comprehend today, because remember in the Exodus, they could repeat almost everything that Moses did by the hand of God, right? So they were very powerful in their enchantments. Well, they conduct a ceremony called the Raising of Osiris ceremony. And we don't know what they did, or at least we don't think we do. The Freemasons and other, like the Rosicrucians, and some of these orders indicate that down through the mystery schools, these enchantments were actually maintained and that are still in their possession. But one way or the other, the Egyptian magicians perform the Raising of Osiris ceremony. The seed of Osiris, hypothetically, comes up from out of the underworld through the obelisk. It magically emits into the pregnant belly of Isis. And the pharaoh goes in as a man. Suddenly he's transmogrified. He comes out, he's a god. And all of Egypt celebrates, right? Because now they have divine representation. And you can kind of see the seeds of this idea throughout history, the divine right of kings, and even the divine right of popes, and a lot of the stuff that developed over time.
Yeah, this goes all the way back to ancient Sumer, where there were kings in ancient Sumer who were claiming to be divine.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. So, but now fast forward to today. What has this got to do with what we're talking about? Well, today, at the inauguration of every American president, while the American president is standing in the U.S. Capitol dome, beneath the magical construct right above his head, 72 pentagrams, the symbolism of the U.S. president becoming Osiris, surrounded by all these pagan deities that came up from Tartarus. I want people to get your book and read it. They'll understand why we keep bringing this up, how important this is. As he's standing there and he's facing the obelisk that's out inside the U.S. Capitol Mall, on 16th Street, right just a little blocks away from the White House, guess what's happening? The modern Egyptian magicians are standing in the temple room. I've been there. In the temple room, there's a giant altar, and right above it, guess what? There's a 666 magic square. Anybody can study this. It's used in antiquity for raising the spirit of Apollo from the underworld. But what they're doing is they're performing the raising of Osiris, right? So it continues to blend these two entities, these two gods. It's one and the same God. It's the double-headed eagle. It's one and the same entity. It's just the Greeks called it one thing, the Egyptians called it something else, but for them, it is this primary God. So while the president stands in the dome facing the obelisk, the same magic is happening. They call up the spirit of Osiris from the underworld. And now why are they doing this? And this really goes to the core of saboteurs. Why are they doing this? They're doing it in anticipation of the day when that magic is going to come to fruition, and the prophecy of the Kume Sybil on the Great Seal of the United States of America, which you started this interview asking about, where she says, "'Tis thine own Apollo reigns," and this is when Jupiter is going to restore his rule. You used his Roman name.
Well, no, it returns old Saturn's reign. Saturn was actually the father of Jupiter.
There you go, Saturn, the father of Jupiter. His reign, though, over the cosmos is going to be restored. But what's happening on Earth is his son rises up to be incarnate on Earth again, to give birth to a new golden pagan age. And it's, interestingly, the Kume, who was the most powerful of all of Apollo's priestesses, she even goes so far as to say, at this time, what's going to be restored on Earth is a time when men once again are commingled with the gods. Well, this is exactly what the Watchers did. The Watchers come down, they commingle with humanity. You have demigods, you have half-gods, right? Whether it's genetics or magic or both or whatever it is, she says this is going to happen again. Well, is it coincidental that, you know, not to get off track, but now we're entering into a time where modern geneticists are already, at least at the embryonic level, creating half-human, half-animal entities.
Chimeras,
so we seem to be entering a period of time that is ready for the return of this god Apollo to planet Earth, and that's what these people are dedicated to, and that's what Trump is such a danger, I think.
When you got, pastors who are praying in the name of Jesus over our president, and we've seen this, several pictures come out of the Oval Office with,
just recently.
Pastors laying hands on President Trump and praying for him. They may see this as a threat, a spiritual threat to the working that they're trying to bring to fruition.
Well, listen, again, if the people that wind up watching this off the record somehow going to become on the record, and this is not going to be broadcast anywhere. What I would say to them is, remember what what Paul said to the Thessalonians. He said the Antichrist is going to be the son of perdition. And the Greek there, perdition, is Apollyon, Apollo.
All right.
So the Bible tells us that this magic they're trying to conduct really is going to lead to the second coming, if you will, of this ancient rebel. Revelation 17:8. The beast will rise up out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. Apollyon, Apollo. And this is the king that these people, that many people believe, by the way, that the Herodome is actually the real power center in Washington, D.C. That the White House, the Capitol Dome, political stuff gets done there, and it's the magic generator that's going to bring about this leader of the end times, this final U.S. president. Remember Roosevelt and his VP, Henry Wallace.
Right.
They were both Freemasons.
Yeah.
And Henry Wallace claims in his own autobiography that he's the one that convinced Roosevelt that the Great Seal of the United States was a Masonic prophecy
Right.
that would foretell a time in the future of America when a U.S. president would come to power and become the leader of a global government. Henry Wallace was a true believer. He
Yeah.
was also dedicated to Roerich and a lot of mysticism.
Right, right. Yeah, in fact, this dovetails with research that Josh Peck and I did for the forthcoming book, The Day the Earth Stands Still. And we get into a little bit of what Wallace was about, sending out Nicholas Roerich to Tibet, basically looking for Shambhala under the guise that this was when he was the Secretary of Agriculture. He was supposedly doing agricultural research but it turned out that he was actually spending U.S. taxpayer dollars to try to find this mystical New Age paradise called Shambhala. And he's also the one who convinced FDR to put the obverse, the reverse side of the Great Seal on the back of the dollar bill.
So that you would see it first, which would go against normative. If you have the front side of something, that's going to be on the left. The back side of it's going to be on the right if you're going to view it that way. And they reversed the order of that. So what were they? What were these Freemasons trying to communicate? Of course, we know that Roosevelt and his wife were kind of into mysticism. A lot of the stuff that the U.S. public is never really ever supposed to know, right? And Hillary Clinton has kept that alive by channeling the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Right, right. Bill Clinton's talked about that in public. Yeah, that's it's occultism in Washington D.C. is nothing new. Colonel Bob McGinnis talks about this, has talked about this publicly on the Jim Baker Show on SKYWATCH TV. Discusses it in his book, The Deeper State. He saw it firsthand. His mother was a personal assistant to the psychic. Whose name escapes me now, the very famous psychic.
Gene Dixon?
Gene Dixon, correct. And he saw a lot of Washington's elite coming to Gene Dixon for spiritual guidance. Of course, this came up again in the 2016 election with some of the WikiLeaks releases. John Podesta, his brother Tony Podesta, and some of the artwork in the home of Tony Podesta is really disturbing. But then also their friendship with a self-proclaimed witch, Marina Abramovich, and some of her activities. These so-called spirit cooking gatherings, and some of the gatherings where they would have a meal that was, and to be honest, I couldn't tell if it was a cake or if it was a giant meatloaf, but it looked like a body, a human corpse, and these celebrities and politicians happily digging in and consuming this body. What is that all about, do you think? What are they trying to accomplish with that, and why in this Christian nation is something like that just sort of considered art?
Well, it's deeply disturbing. Certainly not art, in my opinion. It celebrates cannibalism. And this Marina that you're talking about, she's done all kinds of very disturbing things, squirming around on the floor in blood with snakes. And it wasn't the first time that they created a giant replica of a female nude body, which they then stab in the heart and kill and then cut into pieces, and everybody eats it and cannibalizes the body. And you mentioned Tony Podesta. A lot of the artwork that's in his house that's made it into the news is also disturbing, decapitated individuals. John Podesta had one of his brother's pieces of artwork in his office while he was the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton that shows two men what appear to look like they're sitting down to eat another dead man. Yeah. And he laughingly said, it's better to be the guy with the fork than it is the guy on the table.
Right. And this was published in Time magazine, so this is an internet conspiracy.
And then a lot of the other artwork, frankly, would get some people arrested for pedophilism because they call it artwork, and they have these little nude children who look like they've been spanked and abused, and a lot of very deeply disturbing stuff. But and I dedicate several chapters in the book, Saboteurs, to going to a different place again, though, and that is to talk about how the so-called spirit cooking emails where Tony Podesta, and it's in such casual conversation, it tells you that this is not the first time that they do this stuff, right? He's emailing John Podesta, hey, Marina wants to know if you'll come over to her house this Wednesday for a spirit cooking session. Well, this is stuff that's right out of the teachings of Aleister Crowley and the religion of Thelema. Where you use grotesque elements, body fluids and body parts and stuff like that. but it's a sacrament. It's like a black mass. It's Aleister Crowley's own version of performing magic, including sex magic, elements of sexual activity and sex magic, sperm and things like that.
Right, right.
In order to put yourself into contact with elementals or other spirits. And don't forget that a great part of Aleister Crowley that has, of course, been celebrated by occultists since, had to do with like his Amalantra working. So you got Aleister Crowley, the beast himself, right, 100 years ago or whatever, and he's trying to open a dimensional vortex. What he's trying to do is really the same thing that the raising of Osiris is trying to do. They're trying to draw up from out of the other world or from another dimension and incarnate into this three-dimensional reality an entity. And so he claimed in the Amalantra working that he had brought through this entity. He called it Lam, L-A-M. He drew a picture of it. And interestingly, 100 years later, it looks very much like the alien grays.
Right, right.
That what a lot of people talk about today. Well, years later, 1946, two of his disciples, Jet Propulsion Laboratory founder Jack Parsons, right, and the founder of the Church of Scientology, which is neither religion or science, but the Church of Scientology,
right,
which is based on aliens, by the way.
Yes.
Xenu, or whatever they call him. They wanted to repeat these sex magic workings, but they were not interested in trying to make contact with an alien-looking lamb. They very specifically wanted to incarnate within this reality what the whore of Babylon, the archetype divine feminine, and that was called the Babylon working. Now, why am I talking about this? Because when you read the Podesta emails, it's very obvious that many of the people around Hillary Clinton during the 2006 campaign, but these emails are interchanging, they're practicing the same magic that Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard practice, and Aleister Crowley, which has as its core cause to try to bring something through a dimensional veil into this reality. That's what they're trying to do. Spirit cooking, all that's related to that. Well, when I first saw those emails, a light went on in my head, right? Having to do with what Parsons and them were trying to do. Why? Because Jack Parsons, in his own autobiography, he wrote a kind of a celebratory statement that in 1946, the Babylon working was successful. And he said, he claims, that they brought through this veil, the whore of Babylon, and that she would be incarnate in a female child somewhere in the United States of America in 1946. Well, if you count 9 months forward, then you think, okay, sometime then in 1947, a child would be born. And by the way, they very specifically were trying to bring a female child into the world that would change the mores, the values, away from this Christian idea of family and husbands and wives and all that, to a feminist, the goddess of ancient times, right, to a feminist core ideology. So this child would grow up and become a celebrated feminist, but would also have to have the kind of global, international reach to influence the nations of the world, right? And ultimately that this female would help give rise to the Antichrist. So this brings it full circle back to what the Freemasons are trying to do, which the Bible identifies as Antichrist. They want to bring Apollo through into this reality. So he claims they were successful in 46. This would then mean, if that's true, that a female, a celebrated feminist, would have global reach, would have been born in 1947. And that leaped off the WikiLeaks pages at me because I'm like, wait a minute. And I went and checked. Wasn't Hillary Rodham Clinton born in 1947? Turns out she was. And my whole point about this is not to say that Hillary Rodham is the incarnation of the Babylon working, or that even she believes that. It is to say there were definitely people around her who obviously did believe it, because they're practicing exactly the same magic as the Babylon working, right?
Right.
Now, one other interesting thing as I was doing research on this was that in 1948, now another year later, when this female child would have been about 1 year of age, and before he blew himself up in a rocket experiment and
Right,
died.
right.
Jack Parsons wrote another small book called Book of the Antichrist. And get this, in the Book of the Antichrist, written 69 years ago now, right? He says that the female child at 1 year of age, that the spirit of this child came to him, told him it was alive, it's doing well, it is going to help the rise of the Antichrist, going to fulfill all of his Babylon magical desires, right? But it did something else. It told him its name. And in one line in the Book of Antichrist, she names herself and says, I am Hilarion. And the reason that's important is that that is the root. That's where the word Hillary comes from.
Sure,
That's
yeah.
the archaic Hillary. So, you know, what are the mathematical probabilities that these people around Hillary would fully be aware of all this? Well, much more than I would. I don't practice, you know, studying and keeping up on their magical beliefs. They were very familiar with this. And furthermore, there's a picture in the WikiLeaks, and it shows John Podesta holding up his hands.
Yes.
And in one hand, he's got the number 14. This is the number of pieces that Osiris was chopped into.
Right.
And the other hand is the fish. This is the animal that ate the missing
14th
male
piece, right.
phallus, right? These are necromantic, magical images that are meant only for one purpose. They're getting ready to celebrate. In fact, they said in the WikiLeaks, and this might be something that you and Josh Peck will be talking about in your upcoming The Day the Earth Stands Still. They obviously also believed in what they call contiguous aliens. Again, Aleister Crowley, Lamb, the Church of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, their religions all built on this idea of these both contiguous and distant aliens. But some of the emails indicate that if Hillary were elected, the year 2017 was going to be the year of official disclosure. And in fact, in one place in there, he's talking to a woman who presents herself as a representative from the Vatican, talking to them about the year 2017 being the year of official disclosure. So these people obviously believed, probably still believe, that Hillary either was or still could be the Hilarion. And one final thing. In the year 2020, at the next election, Hillary will be 72.
The same
Years
number
of
as,
age.
yeah, the number of the cosmocraters.
Same year that
Yeah,
Aleister Crowley died when he was 72. It's the number of the cosmocraters. It's the number of the demons in the Goetia. So it's this very important to them. Numbers are important to them.
Oh, sure.
That's why you
Yeah.
can't look at anything in their architecture that doesn't have numbers, and everything is positioned at a certain degree or an angle. Numbers are very important to them, and it was to the ancient Egyptians. For them to carry out their magic, their construct, which can honor the gods and bring about this incarnation of these demonic entities, these demonic spirits. Now, let's just say Hillary was the Babylon working, right? She's the Hilarion. She wouldn't have to be president to help give rise to the Antichrist. She could be president, she could be vice president, or she could just be some other element that is made a part of that government that helps the feminist aspects of the world aim the world back towards more of a globalist, totalitarian, socialist. What if Bernie Sanders, an avowed socialist? So it could be some other way. I'm not saying again that I believe that's what's happening. I believe there are people around Hillary and other very important Washington, D.C. based, very powerful political figures that are entrenched in every other person's pocket, right? That certainly could have sway over the future of our government, and therefore is, was Donald Trump, was he allowed to be elected against all odds? Because of what maybe the Jews believe? Many of the rabbis right now are talking about Donald Trump as being a forerunner of the Messiah. Others that maybe he gave a pause to the globalist scheme, and the church now has an opportunity, You know, 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. Is this a moment in time that we've been given? I think that when you look at the occult element out there, they're behaving as if they're worried about that. That's why binding utilities against Donald Trump and all who abet him, that's what they're saying.
Right, right.
Right?
Yeah, so it's not just against him personally, but against anybody who supports him. And that's why there's been such a reaction amongst that element of the American public, the Antifa movement and other reactionary movements supported by globalists such as George Soros and others. He's not the only one.
Right.
Is targeting not just Donald Trump, but all who support him to marginalize and demonize those who supported the president as racist, provincial, backward, people who need to be marginalized because they're not qualified to. There were people who were actually saying that the hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey, which is going to be the most costly natural disaster in American history. But when you add Irma to it, you're talking almost $300 billion by some estimates, the cost of cleanup and repair for those two hurricanes. They targeted Florida and Texas, and there are those who are saying, well, the states got what they deserve for supporting Donald Trump. Like, that is a beyond natural, that is a supernatural level of hatred. And I think it speaks to what you cover in the book, Saboteurs. This is a supernatural war in which we're fighting. Paul said so in so many words 2,000 years ago, and yet we Americans, especially as we get caught up in the almost the sport aspect, the way it's portrayed in the media, it's almost covered by the media as a sporting event. How many points do they have on the board? Which states are going to go red? Which states are going to go blue? We get lost in that and forget that we're dealing with a supernatural war around us.
Yeah, that's right. And so this is why I've been saying to people that Saboteurs is probably the most important thing I've ever written, because I think it does the best job ever of making the case that if you believe the Bible, if you believe the Scripture, if you believe the book of Revelation, if you believe Daniel, Isaiah, if you believe the words of Jesus Christ, Matthew 24, we are ultimately going to arrive at a point in history in which the man of sin, again, the incarnation of Apollo, this prophecy on the Great Seal of the United States is going to happen. There is going to be a global empire under the man of sin. And whoever doesn't fall down and worship him and do what he wants are going to be caused to be put to death. And the religious order of the day is going to support him, right? The false prophet and the whole institution, all of the systems. The Bible says a day will come when those who kill you will think they're doing God service. Can you imagine the tortured logic? And yet, isn't that what we're seeing right now? Saul Alinsky, who wrote the book Rules for Radicals, which, by the way, if you read his Rules for Radicals, he describes exactly how to do this. You go out, you create chaos in the street, you convince everybody that everything's wrong and they ought to turn to you to be the answer person to give them their answers, but he dedicates his book to Lucifer. So at the core of what we see happening right now, we are moving towards a moment in time, and it should be concerning to all Americans that among all the people that not even aware they're pawns, they're agents in the game, right? There are those, we learn now, there are those who are very much dedicated to the arrival of the man of sin, and they're doing what they can do right now to call upon that spirit to bring it to fruition. So.
In the words of our friend Dr. Michael Heiser, this has explanatory power over some of the things that over the last year just haven't seemed to make any sense in the way the political elite have responded to Donald Trump, even within his own party. So, well, the book is Saboteurs. The author is Tom Horn. Contributions in the book from Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis, Gary Stearman, Carl Gallups, and yours truly. It is an important book, and we hope you take advantage of it. Tom, again, always an education. We have conversations like this over lunch here often. This is one of the side benefits of working here at Skywatch TV. We thank you for watching as we keep watch. This is Off the Record, and I'm Derek Gilbert.